Dr. Williams, in 2012, wrote a wonderful book, The Lion's World. And so this session is going to be a few Narnia questions, which I will toss to him. And then after about 10, 15 minutes, we'll pause. I know that there's a couple kids in the audience that want to ask some questions, and others as well. And so at that point, I'll turn the mic over to Dwight, and then I'll close with one last question. So let me start with the first question, Dr. Williams. In your wonderful book, The Lion's World, you reference one of my favorite passages from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I quote, "Is he quite safe?" asked Susan. "Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe," said Mr. Beaver, "but he's good." So the question, why does Lewis make Aslan not safe? Why is he not a tame lion?
Thank you very much. And may I just begin by saying thank you to all of you again for this wonderful welcome. Thanks to Marshal for his very generous introduction. And can I check that you can hear me at the back?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So why does he say he's not safe? It's something that runs right through Lewis's writing and his life. When God turns up, things change. And they change in ways we can't plan. His last great novel, Till We Have Faces, which I might say more about later, is essentially, as he himself said in his letters, about somebody for whom the language of God suddenly comes alive. And just as if you'd been using this language in a very kind of smooth and conventional way all your life, and suddenly you realize that it was alive, you'd feel pretty disconcerted by that. So that, I think, is what he's after. When we talk about God, we're talking about a reality so enormous, so unpredictable, so much out of our imagination and our control, that when it hits us, it can change things very, very drastically, and not always in the ways we might have liked or planned. So no, it's not safe.
Thank you. What is your favorite Narnian vignette? The children with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, Jill at the stream with Aslan, the de-dragoning of Eustace, or something else?
Ooh, where do you start, really? I do love the bit with the beavers, partly because the food sounds so wonderful. Fresh fish and boiled potatoes, it's pretty good. I love the scene in The Magician's Nephew, where Aslan sings the world into being. Do you remember that? Where Diggory is watching in the darkness, and he hears this deep sound, and reality begins to emerge out of the darkness, and a sort of tinkling set of harmonies overhead as the stars come out. And that's such a fantastic picture of creation, that creation comes from the mouth of God, and what God is doing is not lecturing, but singing, so that the world comes out in harmonics, patterns of deep resonance, so that the world we're in is a world where things resonate with each other. Sorry, I'm doing another sermon now, but to me that's a really potent image, beautiful scene.
Well, I'm going to jump down a question just to demonstrate my flexibility. Because it's a related to creation in a sense. Lewis, in the introduction to The Great Divorce, says the following: Earth, I think, will not be found by anyone to be in the end a very distant place. I think Earth, if chosen instead of heaven, will turn out to be heaven all along. Only a region in hell and earth. If put second, to heaven, to have been in the beginning part of heaven itself. In other words, when we get to heaven, we're going to realize that we were always in heaven, and if we're in hell, we're going to realize that we're always in hell. And in the Narnia series, Magician's Nephew, Silverchair, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and of course, The Last Battle, he makes multiple references to heaven. So the question, can you explain Lewis's sense of continuity between earth and heaven? And what is your view of heaven? And I know that Lewis also sort of disagreed with George MacDonald in terms of, in The Great Divorce, the ability to take the bus up to heaven. But when we die, can we move towards heaven after the fact?
Huge question, that, and it affects so much of Lewis's writing. What you read is a very complicated passage, indeed.
Tell me.
But what I take him to mean is something like this. God makes us as part of creation. Who we are is bound in with what we belong to. As is sometimes said, the molecules that make us up have had quite a life before they got to us. And they'll have a life when we die and decay. But it means we're all part of this resonating, united world. So if we are to live forever in the presence of God, responding to the act and love of God, it's not as if the whole of what we are is wrapped up and put away, and some little bit is extracted for the soul and it goes somewhere else. It's much more that all the relationships and the connections that we're part of, we find ourselves inhabiting, living in more deeply, more joyfully than ever. And that's what happens at the end of the last battle, isn't it? It's a kind of constant loop, almost. You move from the joy of the world you know into something that's just like the world you know, only deeper and fuller. And from that you move into another version, still deeper and still fuller. Further in, you move further in to the reality, so that heaven, you might say, is living most deeply in the creation and what we are. I think that's what he's after. And it's interesting that, again, at the end of The Great Divorce, hell turns out to be a sort of incredibly shrunk and minimized and deprived existence. All of hell could fit into the tiniest crack in heaven. Hell is where you shrink, heaven is where you grow. That I think is what he's after.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I mean, it's fun to note that Lewis maintains that we are living in the Shadowlands. The reality is heaven. A little bit more of a pointed question. In the introduction to your book, he, Lewis, was, when I was first being educated, I'm quoting you, as a theologian, a slightly embarrassing phenomenon. Why was that true? What has changed? And follow-on question, did this sense of general embarrassment have anything to do with his being denied tenure 3 times by Oxford?
I read Lewis mostly as a teenager and was very struck, very engaged by the vigor of the writing. And I also read him not just as a writer about religious affairs, I read him as a writer about literature. In high school, I studied Milton's Paradise Lost, and the very best book I read on that at the time was Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost. It's a brilliant book, and I think most people who are scholars of that period would still say it's just one of the best books you can read on Paradise Lost. And he wrote this great history of 16th century English literature as well, which is a fantastically good read. So I'd read him not just as a sort of religious hitman, but as a really exciting, enlarging writer, a writer first and foremost. Or indeed, as we sometimes say these days, a public intellectual, somebody who thinks aloud in public about deep matters. So I was a bit taken aback when studying theology, people would freeze a little bit at the mention of Lewis. 2 things. One is, as you say, it's a carryover from his career in Oxford. Strictly speaking, he wasn't denied tenure. He was a fellow of his college for decades. What happened was that he didn't get the promotion to the status of professor that he should have had, frankly, until Cambridge got him right and recruited him. So there was that hangover, because in Oxford in the 40s and 50s, I think being a Christian was about as uncool as it got. The philosophical establishment was very hostile. People looked down on Lewis because he was a popular writer. as you probably know, one of the most awful things an academic can do is write books that people read. And Lewis emphatically wrote books people love to read, so people thought he must be glib, he must be facile, he must be less serious. So there's that. Also, by the time I was a student at Cambridge, he'd very much been taken over by some evangelicals as a sort of evangelical apologist. And he's not that. You know, he's somebody who, as he would say, writes about mere Christianity. He's not pushing a party view. No, he's got some very traditionalist ideas indeed, not least about women. Don't go there really, but nonetheless, what he's doing is not fighting a corner within Christian culture wars, but talking about the Christian imagination, Christian worldview. But many people thought, oh, he's just a fundamentalist in sophisticated disguise. And even now, that persists. A great friend of mine in England, very prominent, very articulate, rather brilliant cleric, whom I used to teach, he was a student of mine, came to see me about a couple of years ago, and on my table was, I think it was the C.S. Lewis Bible or something. I found one of these new publications. And he said to me, oh, for goodness sake, you're not reading Lewis, are you? So I sat him down and told him why he ought to.
John,
I think we have a question out here.
fabulous.
Marison, do you have a question you'd like to read, Dr. Williams? Just put this right up to your mouth, a little bit right there. You're really close to right there. That's a little funny right there.
I feel it.
Stand up. Stand up. There we go. You all hold it and you read.
Which one of the books is
That's okay, okay.
which one of the books is your favorite and why?
Thank you, Marison. Which is my favourite and why? Well, I guess that, like many people, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the one that first grabbed me. First one he wrote, in many ways, the greatest. But I do like The Magician's Nephew very much. I like the period setting. You know, it's set at the end of the Victorian era, and you've got this picture of Victorian London. You've got this wonderful comic character, Uncle Andrew, and he's one of Lewis's great creations. You have this great chaotic scene where Queen Jadis arrives and makes a total mess of London, as it were. I think it's a great book. And you've got these wonderful scenes about creation and so on. So I think The Magician's Nephew would come quite close to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for me. Do you have a favourite?
I've never read them.
Oh, okay. Well, pleasure's ahead for you.
Rose, stand up.
Sure.
You may remember Rose Hawkins.
Hi, Rose.
Hi. Yes. Where did the name Aslan come from?
Good question. Where did the name Aslan come from? Well, it's actually a Turkish word meaning lion. And I don't know where Lewis got it from. It's a good name though. And actually, if you go to Turkey these days, you will actually meet people called Aslan. It's a bit disconcerting. And that's where it comes from.
Nico, do you have a question? Stand up here.
Yes. So, if you had never read the Narnia books, which book would you recommend? Starting with The Magician's Nephew or The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
Ah, another very good question, because The Magician's Nephew is the one that comes first in terms of the sequence of the stories, but it's not the first one he wrote. I think I'd still recommend you to start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's got that unforgettable beginning. It tells you the big story of how Aslan rescues the sort of guilty, frightened little boy by sacrificing himself. It's, you know, it's a punchy story. It's funny as well. And yeah, I think I'd still start with that. They're all quite funny. People sometimes forget that Lewis was a very, very good comic writer. And if I can go off script for a moment, some of you may know his science fiction stories as well. And the first of those is called Out of the Silent Planet. It's about somebody being kidnapped by some wicked scientists, Lewis didn't like scientists, and taken to Mars. And on Mars he discovers the different kinds of life that live on Mars, some very strange kinds of life. It's life, Jim, but not as we know it. And the wicked scientists are there on Mars. This is something which has contemporary resonance. They want to take over the planet, basically, and start human life again on Mars. And people do talk about going and colonizing other planets these days, don't they? And looking for new planets to wreck. But one of the funniest scenes in Out of the Silent Planet, it's a savage bit of satire. The scientist, Western humanity, who made such a mess of this planet, Western is trying to explain to the spiritual rulers of Mars, why Earthlings ought to be taking over Mars. So Western gives this great speech, full of the cliches of early 20th century progressive thinking. Humanity is getting better and better, humanity is liberating itself from the shackles of all sorts of things. The mind is so much more important than the body, and we can, as well, upload, he doesn't say that, upload our minds to new contexts, and older and simpler forms of life just have to disappear. So, Western doesn't speak Martian, but the hero of the book has learned Martian in his time there. So he has to translate. Now he says to Western, I'm sorry, I don't quite know how I'm going to translate all this. I'll have to put it very simply. So he says to the archangel who rules Mars, he says, what my friend says is that human beings are quite clever, and because they're quite clever, they believe that it's right that they should kill people who are less clever and take their stuff and live on their planets. And it's a wonderful passage because the whole of this frothy uplift that Western has been coming up with about the manifest destiny of the human race is just boiled down. Well, humans are greedy, and they'll do what they want if you let them.
A question for me, Dwayne? Oh, okay. You mentioned Till We Have Faces, one of Lewis's favorite books, and as you know, his most imaginative work. Why did it not achieve popular acclaim? And related question, why is this, or how is this a Christian work?
Thank you. This is about Till We Have Faces, which is the last great fictional work Lewis wrote. And I find it just a completely compelling book. I remember the first time I read it, when I'd finished it, I started reading it all over again straight away. I just felt I had to take it in more deeply. But it's not an easy work. It's a retelling of a Greek myth, the myth of Eros and Psyche, and quite a complicated story in some ways. He sets it in the ancient world. It's a kingdom just outside the Greek cultural world, probably somewhere in, I don't know, the Caucasus, somewhere like that, or the Balkans. And he imagines in this world what it would be like for somebody who'd grown up with the paganism of the day, actually to come into contact with the living God. If you've been a pagan living in this rather barbaric world, what would happen if somehow, mysteriously, the true God came through to you in all this? And, well, it's the tame lion thing. The result is very shocking, as I said earlier. And it's told in the voice of this princess from the tribe that we're looking at. Her sister is Psyche in the myth. And in the myth of Eros and Psyche, Psyche is a king's daughter who is, as it were, seduced by Eros, by divine love, and leaves her family and her palace to follow divine love. Great sort of symbolic story. And what Lewis does is to make this a real novel, a real story about people, so that the Princess Orwell sees her sister, as she believes, going mad, going out onto the mountain to meet the terrifying, horrific beast, the divine monster who lives on the mountain. And Orwell at one point goes out onto the mountain to see if she can track down her sister, and finds her living in rags, eating nuts and berries, and saying, "I've never been happier." And Orwell thinks she's completely mad. But she has to go back, and because of various things, she ends up being the queen of this kingdom. And she becomes a more and more tough, ruthless, difficult woman, because she's pushing away all the time what she's seen in her sister. She sort of can't quite believe that her sister is as mad as all that. She's haunted by this image of her sister giving everything up for the god. And only at the very end does she suddenly see what it's all about. It's a terrific book. And the end of the first half, she says, I want to confront the gods face to face. I want to ask them why they do these things to us. Why do they break up families? Why do they connive at suffering and meaninglessness? I want to ask them face to face. And then at the end of the second half, as she's in fact dying, she says, I ended the first part of this record by saying I wanted to ask the gods face to face. And now I know that before the face of the gods, the questions fall away. And how can I see the face, how can we see the face of God till we have faces? We have to grow as human beings before we can understand how God works. And that wonderful interweaving of those things. We have to grow, we have to get faces before we can see the face of God. It's wonderful, but it's not easy. It's a brilliant book, it's very vivid, vigorous, but the ideas are challenging. It's not a tame book, you know. But it's good.
Yeah, it's good. So Wiley has a question for you. Wiley?
Is Aslan supposed to be God?
Aslan is supposed specifically to be Jesus. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, he's called the son of the great emperor over the sea. So he's somebody who's sent by the great emperor, by God, into Narnia to sort things out.
Kind of like,
John, one more.
Sorry,
Okay.
somebody in the front.
kind of like Narnia's God.
Narnia, the country, is us, it's the earth. Aslan is Jesus coming from the emperor over the sea, from God, to heal and transform the earth. So Narnia is a kind of image of what we're like, only more so.
So I'm going to ask last question, and this is going to involve me reading again, which is a challenge. So on January 14th, 1949, in the Latin letters, I'm sure that's one of the 9 languages you speak, Lewis writes, "As for my own work, I would not wish to deceive you with vain hope. I am now in my 50th year. I feel my zeal for writing and whatever talent I originally possessed to be decreasing. Nor do I believe, do I please my readers as I used to." And he goes on with despair, writing basically at the same point in time he's beginning the Narnia tales. So the question is, how could he feel such despair and yet be so creative and inspired? And what is the lesson in this for all of us?
Well, I think that by the end of the 1940s, Lewis felt he'd almost written himself out as a defender of the Christian faith. He'd written all these sort of tough, crisp, popular books about the Christian faith, kind of batting away the objections. And they're very clever, they're very entertaining almost. But he felt increasingly that he wasn't saying all that needed to be said, and he was moving already towards writing more imaginative literature. He knew also that, yes, didn't necessarily please his readership, who wanted more straightforward stuff. So I think he felt he was taking a risk in this development of doing more imaginative writing. And he said on one other occasion that he never felt so unconvinced about a Christian doctrine as when he'd just written a brilliant essay about it. It's as if in his attempt to make sense of the Christian faith, he had to let go of something. He had to let go of the idea that you could, carve it up and nail it down and all the rest of it. And for him, the imaginative writing was so much more important as a way into the fullness of it. But yes, it was a risky thing for him to do, and he did feel at times a bit lost with that. And the final great risk he took, in a way, was the journal he wrote after his wife died, when he felt so totally desolate, totally abandoned by God. And he writes this amazing book, A Grief Observed. And that shows you how far he'd come from the sort of knockabout apologist of the earlier days. Till we have faces, he'd become a much bigger person. And so he had a much bigger God. And you may remember that's one of the things he says at one point in the Narnia books. I can't remember if it's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Lucy meets Aslan again. And Lucy says to Aslan, "You look bigger, have you grown?" And he says, "No, you have."
Well, I want to thank Dr. Williams in helping us see a larger Aslan, so thank you very much.